for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I shall be reading the abridged version of the statement of the group of friends. Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is honored to take the floor on behalf of the delegations of Algeria, Angola, Belarus, Bolivia, Cambodia, China, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Iran, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Nicaragua, the State of Palestine, Russia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Syria, Zimbabwe, and on its own behalf, all of which are members of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the Group of Friends recognizes the functions and the powers of the United Nations Security Council as it relates to the maintenance of international peace and security. However, we believe that the measures provided for in Chapter 7 should only be taken as a last resort and in accordance with the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Thorough consideration should be given to the short and long-term effects of the measures that the security adopts or may adopt in order to guarantee precisely that unintended consequences, in particular an adverse impact on civilians and on the delivery of humanitarian assistance, are avoided and prevented at all times. We stress the need to ensure that the population of the states subject to such measures is not victimized, be it directly or indirectly, nor deprived of their own livelihoods and development. Further, greater efforts should be made to address concerns on issues of due process and transparency in listing, delisting, and exemption procedures. This should include looking at humanitarian concerns and ensuring that the population in the countries subject to such matters have access to adequate resources for the financing of humanitarian imports. This is especially important as a concrete way of preventing any possible adverse humanitarian and socio-economic impact of the measures adopted by the Security Council on the basic living conditions of the population. Likewise, we reject the manipulation of humanitarian assistance for political purposes. Humanitarian assistance represents a fundamental part of the protection of civilians in armed conflict and must be provided in accordance with the guiding principles established in General Assembly Resolution 46/182. Mr. President, we wish to raise awareness as to a growing and worrisome trend, which is that when it comes to sanctions, this Council's authority and powers have been usurped by some states which consider unilateral coercive measures, whether political or economic, as their preferred tool to exert pressure, particularly on developing countries, to force the sovereign will of another state in order to obtain all sorts of advantages. This practice is not only a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter, but also a sign of contempt for the authority and powers of this body, which in turn undermines its integrity and effectiveness. Today, we are seeing not only an unprecedented use of unilateral sanctions, but also a new generation of illegal measures, which are now much more cruel and destructive. Such illegal measures are being used as weapons in pursuit of geopolitical and economic objectives. Nowadays, they are enforced and coordinated by a broader and larger group of governments. This is what will become known as a new group unilateralism. Its goal, however, remains the same: to force the political will of sovereign and independent nations, and to curb their industrial development and technological progress, while exerting the greatest possible pain and suffering on the populations, all as a part of a policy of the greatest calculated cruelty. The application of unilateral coercive measures which aim to target the civilian population as part of a widespread and systematic policy which ultimately generates unnecessary suffering that constitutes crimes against humanity prevents the full achievement of economic and social development. This is particularly true in developing countries. And in turn, it has an adverse impact on the realization and full enjoyment of human rights. In other words, they create and exacerbate poverty and inequality, and they also represent a deliberate attack on the right to development. Likewise, interference in the internal and sovereign affairs of states, added to the imposition of economic, financial, or commercial unilateral coercive measures, in addition to representing a widespread violation of human rights and causing great suffering and pain to entire populations, deliberately foment conflicts and crises, including through the creation of premeditated so-called man-made humanitarian crises by the very same promoters of such illegal measures that have now even become structural and driving factors of these contemporary crises. For this reason, we call on this Security Council to, once and for all, condemn the imposition and the tightening of unilateral coercive measures, particularly in the midst of the worst pandemic of the last 100 years. We further call on the Council not to ignore the multiple calls for the elimination of such measures, especially in the midst of the current international situation. Their adverse and even tragic impact, as documented by UN independent experts, added to the effect of secondary sanctions and the phenomenon known as overcompliance, continues to prevent states subject to unilateral coercive measures from the effective and timely acquisition of food, medicines, supplies and equipment, vaccines, and other essential goods for the civilian population. This clearly shows the ineffectiveness and, rather, the non-existence of the alleged humanitarian exemptions in force. This is acknowledged in the conclusions of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the adverse impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. In conclusion, the group of friends undertakes to spare no efforts to preserve, promote, and defend the validity and prevalence of the United Nations Charter. To that end, we must both ensure that unilateral sanctions are fully and immediately lifted and proceed to conduct a comprehensive and exhaustive review of the measures imposed by the Security Council, and that in order to ensure that they are in accordance with the spirit and letter of our founding charter. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for his statement.